Hey, BassGeek here, and it is winter time, and everybody's telling you you need to throw a jig. But do you know which one? Do you know why? And do you know where? Well, I'm going to show you that part. Let's go. All right, geeks, you know if you've been around this channel for any number of years, I am a jig freak. I am a swim bait freak. I am a jig freak. I've just been doing it forever. Literally, one of the first baits I ever fished and caught a bass on was a jig. It was one of my first loves. It was basically a worm and a jig. That's kind of how it went. Then spinnerbait, then a popper, and I think a jerkbait. So that's kind of how my bass fishing life went. Now, all that being said, jigs. Wintertime jigs. Everybody tells you you should throw a jig, you should throw this jig, you should throw that jig. For me, there's a certain jig head, a couple, 3 jig heads that I really like this time of year. I'm going to show you a couple of those. I forgot to bring one with me, but I'll tell you about it. I'll show you when, where, and why I like to throw each one of these jigs and the trailers to go along with them. All right, let me go show you these things. Now for me, geeks, I don't use a swim jig a whole lot during the winter time because I'm not looking for something that's really moving a lot unless I'm really fishing around somewhere that has grass or maybe some docks or standing timber. Most of my lakes generally are going to be rock and more rock and then some logs thrown in there. A few boat docks here and there. But I don't fish a swim jig a lot during the wintertime, the heart of wintertime, simply because it's moving most of the time, right? Yeah, you can set a swim jig down and you can let it sit there, but a swim jig is really at its best when it's being swam. There's really 3 types of jigs that I like this time of year. I'll use them in different ways in different places. So let's start off with the one that everybody really talks about and has talked about for years, and that is the football head jig. Now this is a War Eagle Pro football head jig. This jig is a jig that I really like in those softer sloping areas, rocky areas, but not like just slabs of rock. I'm not going to throw it around riprap either, but this is something that I love to throw when I can drag it, right? That's why the eye tie is right here, and then when you drag it, it's going to slightly lift, and that's when it's at its best, dragging the football head jig. Now, probably the jig that I'm going to throw the second most during the wintertime is going to be a ball head jig, some sort of finesse style jig. And one of my very favorites, of course, is the War Eagle Heavy Finesse jig. A ball head jig is something that I like to fish when I'm around steeper areas. So something where I can just move it a little bit and it's going to fall off a ledge. I love it around bluffs. I love it around steep channel swings, and I love it on points with steeper drops because it's not something that I'm going to drag a whole lot, but it is a bait that's going to get more bites compared to the football head jig. Now I will fish this in a lot of the same places that I'm going to fish a football head jig too if I need more bites, because it's really finessey as compared to the football head jig. But this little jig is really good around that steeper stuff this time of year for me. Last but not least is the Jiu-Jitsu. Now it's more of an archy style head. What I love about that is it's great around wood. This bait comes through wood. A lot of you guys will know it as a casting or a skipping. I think the Archy company was the first one to make this style of head. So it's really something that I love to fish. I've said this all the time. This is probably my favorite go-to head when I'm just casting down a bank, covering water, because it can do everything the other 2 jigs do and a little bit more, like skipping and coming across wood. Now I do want to talk to you about color. So I keep colors really simple when it comes to jigs. I keep it down to about 4 colors 90% of the time. And a lot of that's going to depend on what I'm trying to mimic, like white, for example, when it comes to a swim jig. So for the most part in clear water, guys, I mean, accent colors, you know, we'll talk about that in another video. That's really my go-to. 99.9% of the time is a green pumpkin jig. I'll have a black and blue for when it's super dirty water. I'll have a watermelon, which basically equates to a green jig. When it comes to trailers, especially on the football head jig, I want something with zero movement. These right here, these are the rodents. You can do any kind of beaver style bait, and a lot of times what I'll do is I'll even clip those off so that that's all it is. I'll cut this down a little bit and put it on. I'll show you, because I'm going to show you how to fish this in just a few seconds. But this is one of my favorites. A lot of times my go-to, especially on the Jiu-Jitsu, is just going to be the good old salty chunk by Zoom. I'm old school, man. I have grown up fishing pork trailers, but I'll literally hang this off that Jiu-Jitsu. It's something that I've done forever. And I've got a lot of bites even during the summertime, just because that thing is so super subtle. Now, something new that I've been toying with that I'm a big fan of, and that's Great Lakes Finesse. And these are the little snack craws, and I will use this as a chunk on the ball head. Again, I keep it pretty straight. This is kind of a brown, so it's a green pumpkin, basically. These on that ball head, they get bit. I mean, they get bit. We'll talk about that in a little bit too. All right, let me show you how I actually rig some of these baits. And this is one of my favorite summer go-tos. You know, summer and winter are a lot alike, and this is just super simple. Now, I always do put a little touch of glue on these, but I do cut this down to about the 3rd little notch there. So I'll take this bait and cut it as straight as I can right there. And then, of course, I'll measure about right there. I'll bend that weed guard forward, and I'll slide it up on here, come out in the dead center, and shove it up on past the keeper. Now, like I said, I'll normally put a little bit of glue on there, but for time's sake right now, we're going to keep away from doing that. Now, you see me messing with the skirt right now, and a lot of times, a lot of guys are going to trim these skirts down. In the wintertime, I don't want that. If you've ever seen a craw in the winter when it's cold, they tuck in tight to the body. And, you know, these skirts are already trimmed down pretty good. Now, I'm also not going to trim this because I want my guard to come slightly past the barb, and you can see that's already cut just perfect. Something that I do is I spread my weed guard out side to side, so that if this does come up and maybe fall over, it's going to act as a catch or something, basically, to keep from it rolling over and hitting that hook. So I'm going to spread that weed guard out. Then, not to mention, spreading that weed guard out, what it does for you too is it makes it a little thinner, so you get a better shot at getting good hook penetration. All right, that's how I rig up my football head jig. Now, I always thread, even if I'm going with some type like the Zoom salty chunk, I always thread all the way up on when it comes to a football head. Now, when it comes to an Arky style or a, you know, the Jiu-Jitsu, something that I do is simply this. I grab my salty chunk, I stick her right in the middle. You've got your jig. Again, don't cut the skirt during the winter time. Now this one I may cut a little bit, it's a little bit past it, but a lot of times I won't do that. I also, especially with this one, I'll spread that because I'm going to throw this into wood. I'm really going to target wood a lot of times with this particular jig. Now let's talk about the ball head, the little finesse ball head. And I'm going to tell you, it is really important to spread a ball head's weed guard out wide, because they will roll. If you come across the least amount of wood, they will roll over, and if that thing's tight, it's going to roll over, push that weed guard, and get you hung. So they do not like wood, in my opinion, at all. So you really do need to give it a little bit of help. And then with the new Great Lakes snack crawl, I hang it on just like I would a chunk. I just come up to about that third line and I pop it through. So I just bring it up and I hang it on, and there you have it. Now let's go fish these things. All right, geeks, so this is one of the places where I'm going to tell you, when it comes to bottom bouncing baits, light bite baits is kind of what I put them in the category of. This is where you want to spend your money. Like, you don't have to spend your money on high-end rods anywhere else but this. Not for swim baits, not for Damiki rigging, not for A rigging, but you need a couple of good rods, spinning rods, casting rods. When it comes to me, Texas rig, shaky heads, you can get away, Ned rigs, but this is where you want to be able to detect those bites. Rod, reel, and line is extremely important. And that's why I'm going with the highest of high end when it comes to rods, TFO's Resolve Bass. This thing is super light and super sensitive. This is a 7.6 heavy. I fish a lot of clear water. If you need to target a little bit better, go down to about a 7 or a 7.3. But this thing is incredible. Half ounce to a 1.5 ounce, but I will even throw 3/8 ounce jigs on this. And I've got that coupled with an arc gravity. Man, this reel is impressive. I've been able to cast some stuff on this rod coupled with this rod that is crazy. And an 8 1-to-1. I'm not flipping with this. If I'm flipping, I like a 7, because it comes down to speed versus torque. The higher the speed, the less torque you're going to have. So for me, I like an 8-1 when I'm fishing a little more open water like we're talking about today. Line. This is also, we're fishing open, a little more open water. I'm going to go with K9 line as always. And, to me, honestly, the best line in the business, the Pro 100 when it comes to these bottom bouncing baits, which is 100% fluorocarbon. That is the only way to go. And I'll fish it in 15-pound test line. Now, it's going to be 15 to 20, depending on how much cover I'm going to be around. All right, let me go show you where I fish each one of these jigs and how I fish these jigs in the winter. Now, this is the type of bank I'm talking about when I talk about a football head jig. So it's a little more sloping. It's kind of a mix of rock and mud, and I can drag it. Now, it could be all rock, and of course I always want to look for transition areas in this type of stuff, especially like right over here where it changed to bluff, or from bluff to chunk rock and mud. But this is the type of area that, for me, a more sloping style bank is where a football head can really shine. Now, again, you can fish any of these anywhere, but to maximize the design of each jig, this is where I'm fishing a football head. Now, what am I going to do? I'm going to throw it out there. I'm going to make a long cast. And something that I always do, it's kind of a starting point for me, is I start in the wintertime about 10 feet deeper than, unless I've got cover, about 10 feet deeper than what the visibility of the lake is. So if I can see in this lake right now about 8 feet, I'm going to start at about 18 feet. That's where I'm going to start fishing. I'm going to throw right in that area, give or take, 4 to 5 feet. Might start in the 12, 13 foot area. But a lot of times I'm going to start out there in that 18 foot area. That's where I'm going to go. Those bass are going to live there on the edge of that visibility down. Now, a football head jig, I'm going to make a cast. I'm going to let it sink to the bottom. And then I'm going to reel my slack out and I'm going to barely move it. You'll be surprised. One thing about forward-facing sonar that I've learned is how much we actually move our baits, and it's crazy. So tiny movements of the rod tip, and that's it. I'm going to drag it. I'm going to let it sit. I'm going to keep my line taut. I'm going to drag it. I'm going to let it sit. That's what I'm going to do with a football head jig. One of the biggest keys to catching more bass on a jig is making sure your rod position is correct. So when you're reeling down, keep that rod tip at about a 3 or a 9. I call it a 9 o'clock position. From there, reel your slack out and lift. You never want to go past the 11 o'clock position because you'll be out of position to be able to set the hook. So never get your rod tip too high because you won't be able to set the hook. And a lot of jigs have a little bit heavier wire hook on them, so you're going to want to be able to set that hook and drag those bass in. Now, let's talk about a ball head jig. So now, Bluff Walls, this is where I love to fish a ball head jig. Now, like I said earlier, you can fish any one of these. They're interchangeable, but if you want to get the best out of them, you want to get hung up less. These are the areas that I tend to fish each one of them. And a ball head jig, for me, I love to throw it in a place like this. Maybe not even this deep, but channel swing banks. You know, you can have sort of the same type of areas, but when it gets into that bigger chunk rock, and lots of it, I'm going to a football head jig. This, I love to throw a ball head jig because I can come down this bank, I can parallel it, I can throw it up shallow and just let it step down these rock walls. But it's a little more finessey jig, especially this time of year, and the bass will come out from under it and they will chew the paint off of it. So the Jig Jitsu or the Arky style jig, this is when I love it right here, you know, skipping it around docks, getting it in places where, you know, there's some wood, where there's a little bit more cover. That's where this jig really tends to shine. You know, I can flip it into this. It's a great wood flipping jig. It's probably what I'm going to go to when I'm around wood because it comes over wood so well. Most of the time I'm going to start out kind of working the perimeter, especially this time of year. 90% of the time these bass are going to be out on the deep edge, and you can really just kind of cast to that deep edge and drop it down because that tree will create kind of this overhead structure that the bass can sit under and hide. So basically you just cast up there. I try to stay back off of it, point straight at it so that the branches are coming with me and I'm not getting in that fork. But I'm going to stay back, make those casts, and work my way in, and just move nice and slow and feel. That's a big key about jig fishing when it comes through wood, developing your feel. Pretty much for all these jigs, when it comes to setting the hook, it's like I said earlier, you want to keep that rod tip at 3, get it up to about a 10 or 11 on your hook set. But at the same time, you want to do the same thing I always say, reel down, sweep to the side, get those fish to the boat. You got a single hook, get them in the boat. Don't play them. Big rod, big hooks, big line. Don't play them, get them in the boat. Geeks, I hope this helps you catch more fish during the winter on a jig, because a jig can produce numbers, but it's a big bass bait. And during the winter time, that's what you're keying in on. You're keying in on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bites a day. And the big bites, well, if you only get one of those a day and it's a big one, that's the day right there. It makes it, right? But all that being said, check out those jigs, man. You can get those on LureNet. They're really good. It's 3 good winter jigs right there. And you guys from the bank, to give you a tip, lighter, a 1/4 ounce ball head, a 1/4 ounce Arky, or a weedless jig. If you're going heavier, something like the Trashmaster or Omega Tackle makes a great, I think it's called the Salvation. They're weedless, check them out. All right, Questions, comments in the comment section below. You geeks know I love to talk fishing with you. Like it if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. Make sure you ring that bell. 100% Watch Squad. Love you geeks. Love all you geeks. Because you geeks rock. Yeah.